The following message is by Pastor John Piper. More information from Desiring God is available at www.desiringgod.org.
I'm writing down a sixth point to conclude with here because I just thought of it. Let me give you 3 reasons why I chose William Cowper to talk about this year. Number 1, I have found since I was 17 years old, probably before, but my memory is not well before that, that poetry has an unusual power in my life. And I don't so much mean reading it as trying to write it. And in reflecting on my own pilgrimage, I went back in my files, and I didn't know I had these, but I found Leaves of Thought, 1964, senior in high school. The Codon, Wheaton College, 1965, I was a freshman. The Opinion from Fuller Seminary, 1972. The Coeval from Bethel when I was teaching there. And I have poems written in all of those books. And it just was a visual reminder to me that ever since I was 17, trying to write poetry has had a very significant place in my life. And there's a reason for this. I've reflected frequently on what happens when I spend the hours it takes to take a fairly simple thought and put it into a new way of speaking. And what I think it is this. I live, as probably you do too, with a perpetual breach between the intensity of my passions and the magnificence of the reality I see. A chasm of inadequacy to say and feel what ought to be said and felt in view of that God, that heaven, that hell, that family, that world, that eternal life. The realities out there have always seemed so magnificent to me that what's in here has always felt inadequate. And poetry has been my lifelong effort to build a bridge across there, to find a way of speaking and really a way of seeing and feeling that attempts to bring just a little closer together the passion within and the glory without. And therefore I have been taken up with those who have expressed their faith in that way, and William Cowper tried to close that breach with poetry, and some of you have. There are other ways of closing it, trying to close it. There is a relief that comes with that. Cowper got a picture of his mother, a portrait of his mother when he was 59 years old. He had not seen her for 53 years. He was dead all that time. And he wrote, "And while that face renews my filial grief, fancy shall weave a charm for my relief." And I think I knew exactly what he meant. Fancy will weave a charm for my relief. Meaning something was building so powerfully on the inside as he watched, as he looked at his mother's picture, that he had to have a relief. And it was fancy, a poem. He wrote a poem on his mother's portrait. There is a deep release and relief that comes in finding new ways of seeing and new ways of saying magnificent truth, all of which is old. My second reason for picking Cowper is that I want to know the man who wrote God Moves in a Mysterious Way. We just sang it. God moves in a mysterious way His wonders to perform. He plants His footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. That hymn, with all of its magnificent understanding of the sovereignty of a good God behind a frowning providence, is the rock bed of my theology. I live by the truth of that hymn, so much so that when I preached a series of 5 messages on Job a few years ago, one of the young women in the church did a needlepoint of this whole hymn for me, and it hangs over my mantle now at home as kind of a way of saying, this is the theology of this household. God moves in a mysterious way. And I want to know the man who wrote that song. In fact, standing there singing these songs just made my heart ache, because they are so magnificent and his life was so utterly miserable. The third reason is because I want to understand, if I can, why he struggled with what we would today call depression. They would call melancholy, gloom, and despair. Why he struggled all his life and died in despair. Why? In view of the kinds of hymns he was at one time able to write. So let's move into it and try to get his life before us, and then we'll analyze at the end the roots of his depression. He was born in 1731 and died in 1800, which made him the contemporary of John Wesley and George Whitefield and the other leaders of the evangelical revival in England. He embraced Whitefield's theology rather than Wesley's. In fact, he tells the story of how as a little boy he would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning while it's still dark and see the people with their lanterns going to hear Whitefield preach at 5 o'clock in the morning. He said, Moorfields was as full of the lanterns of the worshippers before daylight as the Haymarket was full of flambeaux on opera night. So as a little boy, he had this image of people flocking to hear Whitefield preach before dawn on the fields. And he came to embrace the theology of George Whitefield, which was a healthy, robust, warm Calvinism. The most significant Calvinistic influence in Cowper's life was the healthiest man of the 18th century, namely John Newton, the old African blasphemer. And I'm going to dwell on the influence of Newton in Cowper's life, because they are at emotional opposite ends of the pole with the same theology. One as healthy as you could get, I believe, and one as sick as you could get and still live. He was 27 years old when Jonathan Edwards died, just to put him in the American scene. He lived through the American Revolution, the French Revolution. Benjamin Franklin read his poetry and commended it. But he was not a man of affairs. He was a recluse all of his life, spending virtually all of his life in the English little countryside of Olney and then Weston. His life was not the kind of life you would give to a child to read about, because it's boring. There's nothing on the outside that makes it interesting in terms of adventure or politics or public engagement. But one of the differences between children and adults is that adults come to see that the main things in life happen on the inside and not on the outside. The big storms are not the ones that are on the sea that it's fun to write books about, because you almost get washed overboard like John Newton did. But the big storms in life are inside, nobody sees. And that's the kind of epic proportions we have in Cowper's experience. So those of us who have grown up and not altogether put away childish things in our love of adventure, but nevertheless come to appreciate other kinds of stories, find a man's story like this very engaging. He was born November 15, 1731 at Great Berkhamsted near London, a town of 1,500 people. His father was the rector of the Church of England in that town. His father was not an evangelical believer. And therefore he grew up without a saving faith in Jesus Christ. His mother died when he was 6 years old, and his father sent